Hi, my name is Stephen Best. I'm the director of the Townsend Center for the Humanities. And it's my pleasure to introduce our Avenali Lecturer for this year, Avgi Saketopoulou. I'm sure Avgi Saketopoulou has several compelling answers to this question. The piece by Paul Bloom draws on a recent paper by the behavioral scientist Corey Clark on research into taboos and self-censorship within the field of psychology. Clark and her collaborators interviewed professors on a range of taboo topics and discovered that those professors who were more confident in the truth of the taboo statement reported more self-censorship. Participants were asked, A, to measure the truth or falsity of 10 statements, B, how reluctant they would feel sharing their beliefs on the topic were it to come up in a professional setting, and C, whether scholars should be discouraged from testing the veracity of the statement. Among the taboo statements in the study, academia discriminates against Black people in hiring, promotion, grants, invitations to participate in colloquia, etc. Biological sex is binary for the vast majority of people. Racial biases are not the most important driver of higher crime rates among Black Americans relative to white Americans. Transgender identity is sometimes the product of social influence. Bloom wrestles the study into an argument about professors' risk aversion, their schooling, where we've always wanted the teacher's approval, and the nature of academe, we've always wanted the teacher's approval. But along the way, he makes this crucial observation. Almost all the taboo statements where professors felt self-censorship and fear of consequence had to do with sex and race. This sense of ideas of sex and race having stalled, ossified, or sedimented is confirmed in my own experience of recent turns within Black studies, in which certain ideas have been taken as self-evident, shibboleths that either can't be said or must be said to establish one's belonging in the field. The statement that our contemporary reality constitutes the afterlife of slavery, formulations asserting that all Black people are suffering equally and primarily from racism, and that as the mantra goes, nothing has changed. The self-evidence of the phrase, the new Jim Crow. Afro-pessimist claims, and here I'm quoting Frank Wilderson, that, quote, Blacks are not human subjects, but are instead structurally inert props, implements for the execution of white and non-Black fantasies and sadomasochistic pleasures. One hears this repeated by others as objective fact. It is in this context that I have been drawn to the work of Avgi Saketopoulou, able to make my way back to psychoanalysis after years of discomfort with its epistemology of trauma. Avgi Saketopoulou is a psychoanalyst in private practice and founder of the Cypriot chapter of the Palestine Mental Health Network, a faculty member in New York University's Postdoctoral Program in Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis. She's the author of numerous articles in 3 books, Gender Without Identity with Anne Pellegrini, The Reality of the Message, Psychoanalysis in the Wake of Jean Laplanche with Dominique Scarfone, and Sexuality Beyond Consent, Risk, Race, Traumatophilia. Avgi Saketopoulou's scholarship invites us to consider whether we got trauma wrong. We've been trained to think that trauma has destructive effects whose ghostly lingerings, she writes, can nevertheless be durably turned into ancestors. This sense of trauma having destructive, even catastrophic effects ignites therapeutic ambitions of repair and the undoing of wounds. Understood as a ghost, trauma can thus be exercised as if it were possible to organize the psychic imprint of the racial past into a steady state. But what if we got it wrong, she wonders? What if trauma is not a piece of shrapnel to be removed, but a cause of becoming? The question has consequences not only for psychoanalysis, but for the pedagogical relation and the administration of safety that operates under the signs of affirmative consent in sexual encounters and trigger warnings in course syllabi. Whether it is prohibitions against Black people bottoming within the kink community, even when that is their expressed desire, or vehement denunciations of Jeremy O. Harris's Slave Play, a work that is unrelenting in its exploration of the erotics of interracial desire and the implication that racism carries an erotic charge. Traumatophobia carries a surprising set of unintended consequences. By committing to a good politics, to well-meaning efforts to become more attentive to racial trauma, to protect Black people from racial trauma, psychoanalysis does not liberate, but effectively constrains their desire. Black people, in turn, are saddled with an impoverished unconscious, one that warehouses the intergenerationally transmitted trauma of slavery rather than an unconscious that is dynamic and malleable with the potential to give rise to a range of possible desires, symbolizations, and interests, including really odd and unusual ones. Traumatophobia protects an unconscious that Avgi describes as a granary of the past, a reservoir of conservative ideas, conservative though, not in the sense of retrograde or outdated ideas, but those, I quote her here, but those that, I quote her here, seek to conserve our analytic egos, to fortify our defenses by reassuring us that we know what we know in the case of race, trauma, and desire. Traumatophobia embeds certain biases that foreclose the subject's flourishing. Breaking the disciplinary spell that trauma holds over the field of psychoanalysis is the key to Avgi's rethinking of the analyst's job, which is not to heal, but, quote, to resist the narrative of restoration and repair, to refuse the idea that anyone ever returns to some prelapsarian moment, to the restoration of innocence before trauma, end of quote. The analyst's task is to attend to the wide range of ways in which human subjects engage their trauma and reboot those psychic energies. To this end, Sexuality Beyond Consent argues for how to risk experience. Avgi uses the word experience not in the ordinary sense of having an experience of something, like taking the reins of subjectivity in a bid for mastery, but, and here I quote, as something we risk when we soften our grasp on those reins, to undergo something the coordinates and effects of which cannot be secured or anticipated, end of quote. Risk involves a practice of what she calls limit consent, quote, surrendering to an other or surrendering to the opacity in the other or to the opacity in ourselves, end of quote. This is not consent understood as a voluntary agency that we exercise. To risk experience in this way requires challenging the ego's defenses and resistances and bending one's will. That is, a receptivity that has to be rested each time, again and again, against the objections of the ego. I expect to hear in today's talk, Fighting Fire with Fire, Aesthetics, Exigent Sadism, Insurgency, further calls to risk experience, to experience a libidinal current against the objections of an ego invested in our self-preservation. Please join me in welcoming Avgi Saketopoulou as this year's Avenali Lecturer in the Humanities.
Thank you, Stephen, for this introduction, and thank you all for spending some of your life with us today. I'm so incredibly honored to have been invited to give this lecture. Stephen and I have been in conversation about sadism for some time. Thank you to Stephen, thank you to Rebecca Egger. Thanks to Michaela and Eric for all the work behind the scenes to make this run as clockwork as it has. And thank you for being here today. In some ways, if given the introduction that you just gave, Stephen, like if traumatophilia has been in my previous work about thinking about trauma in the retrospective tense, this is about thinking trauma prospectively. So temporal switch, and here we go. Today, I will present work from my current book project, which is dedicated to fleshing out and making available for political action a form of sadism that I have called exigent. My use of exigent sadism for political action draws inspiration from Walter Benjamin's claim that, quote, to improve our position in the struggle against fascism, our task is to bring about a state of emergency, unquote. A state of emergency that he contrasts with the normalized emergencies pleaded through fascism. Bringing about a state of emergency involves taking risks, even gambling some things away, and it has to do with turning away from self-preservation and towards self-defense. Unlike work in Sexuality Beyond Consent, where I explore the aesthetic and political possibilities of non-instrumentality, this new work heeds Carol Levine's caution that anti-instrumental politics, quote, do not in fact yield the revolutionary justice that critics have so often hoped and claimed for it. And it's actually really incredible to be here giving this talk because I was introduced to this work by work at the Townsend Center a year and a half ago. Exigent sadism is thus a decidedly psychoanalytico-political concept that embraces instrumentality. By political, however, I do not mean processes by which citizens work to understand differing perspectives from all sides, win the other's consent, or woo them through rational thinking in the public square. This is not an episode of the Ezra Klein Show. Rather, I refer to what Wolin has described as, quote, the contestation, primarily by organized and unequal social powers, over access to the resources available to the public authorities of the collectivity, unquote. As such, my talk today is not an argument, even though I will be presenting arguments. Rather, in keeping with the performance piece that I will be discussing in the second part of my talk, I think of it as a preparation for something else. To effectuate a crisis, exigent sadism requires that we relinquish the enchantment of repair and the fantasy that ongoing debate or dialogue can bring about change. Like the argument industry, like we really have to let go of that. Where most political theory continues to be effectively bound to the project of democratic repair or even of repairing democracy, my project shares Georges Bataille's critical recognition of, quote, the weakness of liberal and popular frontist responses to fascism's rise, unquote. A recognition that, as Alberto Toscano writes, quote, was the context for Bataille's efforts to win the energies of mass intoxication and even of sacrifice and myth away from the black and the brown shirts, unquote. Now, if the idea of winning the energies of mass intoxication makes you anxious, if it brings to mind Freud's cautionary notes on mass psychology, if the notion of spectacle and of sacrifice reeks too much of right-wing politics to you, it is only, I will argue, because of how much the left has been conditioned to disarm itself. Thank you. In part by suturing itself to this fantasy that reasoned debate, seeing things from the other's perspective, or proceduralism could ever be adequate responses to fascism and genocide. And I'm using the term fascism today not to refer to the totalitarianism that is now more directly touching the lives of white, cis-identified, straight, able-bodied, educated, middle-class people, but in how it is used by theorists like M.S. Césaire, Dylan Rodriguez, R.J. Kelly, and Orisanmi Burton, and revolutionary fighters like Asara Shakur, Leila Khaled, and George Jackson, to talk about how colonized people have long suffered the genocidal operations of capitalism and whiteness. So I offer exigent sadism as a theoretical call to arms. I'm interested, and I want to interest us in the theory that, as the Middle Eastern studies scholar Stephen Sheehy writes, works like the throwing of a stone. Sheehy uses this phrase to discuss Edward Said's disinvitation from the Freud Museum in Vienna, an honor that was recently extended to me too, when he was discovered to be an engaged Palestinian. That is, a Palestinian who threw a stone against the occupation forces, and this is the famous photograph. Quote, when narrating all of this death, writes the Palestinian poet Mohammed al-Kurd about the genocide in Gaza, our journalists are poets that write with knives. And exigent sadism shares this ethic of armed thinking. It is theory with teeth, theory that refuses to be defanged out of fear of being disinvited, discredited, or even persecuted. a theory that is made not only for thinking, but also and especially for action, especially the action of resistance. Drawing on Fanon, I also think of it as muscular theory. Quote, whether we engage in violence or not, Eric Stanley writes, the time of violence is already here, unquote. And so exigent sadism works to keep that wound open, to not look away from state and social violence, to not rationalize it, to urge us not to pull our punches, and to refuse to get ensnared in the all-too-human tendency towards self-preservation. For the psychoanalyst Michel de Muzan, the self-preservative impulse belongs to the order of destructiveness, and I'll say more about this soon. Exigent sadism is to be critically distinguished from common understandings of sadism as a selfish indulgence in an appetite for the others, for cruelty or the other's destruction, which is an understanding of sadism that misreads the legacy of the Marquis de Sade, from whom the term is sourced. When venturing into political analysis, psychoanalytic theory is mostly used as a theory of acquiescence, moralizing the maturational and civilizational advantages of moving towards a depressive position, towards reparation, towards identification with the other, even the ethno-nationalist other, the transphobic other, and the racist other. Psychoanalysis' failure to theorize revolution, and we do not have a theory of revolution in psychoanalysis, has generated a complicity where concepts like do or done to and splitting are used in ways that are subordinate to whiteness, to settler colonialism, and to state power, which is something that my colleagues Lara and Stephen Sheeha have already analyzed very powerfully in their book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. My goal is to flesh out, so not only that, but also as Anne Pellegrini notes, when psychoanalytic theories use the term resistance, it is something to be made use of and to be overcome. My goal is to flesh out a psychoanalytic theory of political resistance, to wield psychoanalysis as considerable resources to theorize the importance of what Sophie Lewis calls drawing lines of enmity, to cultivate an erotics of anti-fascism, and to explore what I am calling the revolutionary impulse, the impulse to give oneself, that is, over to actions that stand to disrupt state and imperial violence, that resist oppression and oppose ethno-nationalism, and which involve true risk for those undertaking them, such as participating in protests, riots, work stoppages, blockades, sabotage, and others. The capacity for revolutionary action derives, it's going to be my argument today, from what the psychoanalyst Nathalie Salzman describes as the insurgent, more anarchic qualities of the libidinal current. So if we want to relibidinize the left, this will involve not only welcoming, but also enduring the full spectrum of the libidinal current. And that means more than just the excitement or relishing the dizzying excitations of revolutionary energy. Rather, I am heeding Laplanche's deft critique of Freud, who, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, revised his theory to give us a domesticated, defanged understanding of the erotic, which omitted the more dysregulating elements of the libidinal drive, giving us a libidinality, in other words, that is purged of its aggressive and violent dimensions, depleted of its sadism. And this is the libidinality we usually think about today, and it doesn't get more kind of like more disarmed than that. This excision meant that the demonic aspect of libidinality would need to be relocated elsewhere. And this is Laplanche's argument. This made it necessary for Freud to conceptualize a new space that he called the death drive, and which is now seen as pure destructivity that yields only annihilation. For Laplanche, the critical polarity, however, is not between a domesticated eros, that is ultimately a good thing because it makes us love life and love ourselves and love each other, and a thanatos that is ultimately a bad thing because it orients us towards ruination, but between the forces of binding and unbinding, and both of these reside within libidinality. Binding is thus not always a good thing. As I elaborated in Sexuality Beyond Consent, binding always has an appropriative, possessive, and dominating relationship with alterity, both the other and one's own. Totalitarian, for example, is an extreme version of binding. Nor is unbinding always a problem. The libidinal violence of unbinding is in fact necessary for the ego's energy to be disinvested, divested from racist or transphobic investments, and have a chance to be redirected against oppressive, colonial, imperial, or transphobic projects. This is not to idealize unbinding, which can also operate in a racist, ableist, and transphobic mode when it is actually commandeered towards eliminating the other's otherness. And in that case, it can also unleash annihilatory forces. But my point is this: domination, as well as the ability to combat oppression, both derive from the same fragmenting and destabilizing elements of libidinality. And this is one reason why a rights or justice-based counter to fascism fails. Good liberals who are libidinally overinvested in their own sense of goodness, in their own purity and their own innocence, which is a rigid binding, will not be able to garner their aggression, even their sadism, which is a key component of the libidinal, first towards their own self, towards their own bindings, in order to be able to give themselves over to the revolutionary impulse and to engage in insurgent actions, neither to be able to direct it towards oppressive others. I put this so strongly and so confrontationally, not only because it's my style, but also because I'm wary, and I think many of us are tired of the more reasoned ways in which the left imagines it can do its politics. For example, when we tell ourselves, and this is so popular right now in psychoanalytic institutions, and not only, that transphobia can be mitigated if only we disrupt false stereotypes and educate bigots. If, as Dagmar Herzog, Jeff Charlotte, and Alberto Toscano have persuasively shown, fascism has a libidinal appeal, and I think that it does, so should our resistance. We will have to fight fire with fire. So no more of the hubris of going high when they go low. We will have to relinquish our prized attachments, so popular on the left, that we are virtuous and irreproachable, upright citizens that see that violence is not the answer. Violence has, at the very least, to be the question. Our own goodness, our moral superiority cannot be the means by which we fight fascism. If collective liberation is, as Dylan Rodriguez puts it, quote, an act of war, or at least a threat against the rising tide of white invitation into a resurgent white reconstruction, unquote, fighting this war will require us to get our hands dirty, even to fight dirty, and to engage our aggression, to rethink our orientation to resistance and to embody and enact it differently. We will have to go low, not in the sense of dehumanizing others, but abdicating our attachments to ourselves as being free of rage or hatred, which is a form of binding. Such transformation, if it happens, would be a form of unbinding, and as such, it is not something that one can be persuaded to do. Nor is it a matter of being committed enough to a set of ideals, because in fact, the idea that one should just work harder is itself a form of binding. Such transformation requires enduring the vulnerability of libidinal divestment, and this is not something we're ever ready for or ever feel safe doing. So, enduring the vulnerability of libidinal divestment rather than collaborating with fascism or liberalism. What, after all, do we accumulate cultural capital for, if not to spend it down at a time of crisis? Perhaps surprisingly, this is what aesthetic projects can put in motion, not just in our imaginations, but also in our musculature, a Fanonian idea to which I'll return. If the aesthetic feels too soft, too supple for a project of that gravity, consider Rizvana Bradley's query. Why, she asks, quote, aesthetics now, when catastrophe has become the watchword of the world, of the day, when all but the most restrictive pragmatism could easily be construed as little more than bourgeois frivolity? Because, she continues, the fascism which liberal modernity and civil society has always required has never abided by this order's mendacious separation of the political from the aesthetic. Genocide, now as before, is an aesthetic project, unquote. The drunkenness of myth, the Dionysian pleasures of mythologizing make different bids on the political, and art and performance have the capacity to bring us to states of overwhelm, to risk things that we would never agree to risking, states when we can become unbound, disrupted, destabilized, states where the impulse for self-preservation gives way to something else. The domain of the aesthetic, Bradley tells us, is not a programmatic project. It is an absolutely dispossessive field. And as such, it may well be a path to becoming disenchanted with our commitment to reason and understanding, to break with our preoccupation with self-preservation, tuning into even being carried by currents that are wilder, undomesticated, and untamed. And the aesthetics of sadism, I suggest, play a protagonistic role in this process. In her book on self-defense, the philosopher Elsa Dorlin offers a genealogy of how the right to bear arms has been historically curtailed, tracing what she calls the unhappy subjectivation of those, quote, who are kept in check and disarmed through violence, unquote. Where colonial laws produced a class of persons presumed always already guilty of phantasmatic aggressions, a separate class of white colonial subjects was constituted, quote, always entitled to demand justice, to defend their property, respond to imagined offenses, protect women from hallucinated attacks. It is to this group that the right of self-defense properly belongs, strictly delineated along gendered and racial lines, even as it is presented as a right accorded to everyone. The enslaved, indigenous people, sex workers, drug users, rape victims, disabled people, children are all effectively deprived of the right to exercise violence in their own self-defense. Because of that, we have also been conditioned to understand violence as being only, and this is one of my important thoughts today, or the important interventions, we are conditioned to understand violence as being only and always an expression of tyrannical power, ceding all too easily what movements like the suffragettes and the Black Panthers have taught us, that violence is a political possibility. Relinquishing the right to self-defense, Dorling argues, is how minoritarian subjects are made to live as prey. In her book's opening, she offers the following scene. It is 1803, and we're in Guadeloupe, where a tribunal has sentenced Millet de la Girardière to be placed, quote, in an iron cage and left there until dead. The person confined therein is forced to straddle a sharp blade. His feet are shackled, and he must keep his legs straight to avoid being wounded by the blade. When the victim weakens, he falls on the edge of the blade, which inflicts deep and cruel wounds. Then he pulls himself upright from the pain, only to fall again on the cutting blade, wounding himself horribly. This torture lasts 3 or 4 days before he dies of his injuries, unquote. This is an evil scene that is made more atrocious by how de la Girardière's self-defense is turned into a technology of domination. The more he tries to defend himself, the more defenseless he proves to be. Dorling compares this with a spectacular scene that opens Discipline and Punish, where Foucault details the tortured public execution of Damiens for his attempt at regicide. Foucault contrasts this mode of punishment to how punishment works in disciplinary societies to illuminate the shift from public spectacle to subtle, pervasive forms of control that is mostly away from torture and through constant surveillance, normalization, and the internalization of disciplinary norms towards the creation of docile bodies. But whereas Damiens' power does not matter, de la Girardière's very much does, because the entire point is his capacity to react so as better to dominate him. By cultivating in the condemned the illusion that their life depends on their strength, the torture machine coaxes every last vital impulse. The more repeated and desperate the convict's efforts to survive, the more repressing authority succeeds in governing it. Now, this is a very dramatic example, but not a rare example in the colonies, of how power stokes the urge to self-defend, only to then use it against the torture. A much less dramatic but very current example can be found in Columbia's and Berkeley's capitulation to the Trump administration's fascist demands. Surely universities are not the most important sites of these violences. We are seeing people being abducted and disappeared. The US is funding a genocide as we speak. But I turn to the university briefly because, well, I'm giving a talk at a university, and at a university at that just handed 160 names of faculty and students to the government. And I'm also interested in universities as the very site where we on the left are being disarmed. Much as universities are intended as crucial sites of critical thinking, which is in part why they're targeted, perhaps, arguably. They're also sites where we're disciplined into thinking as a form of conducting ourselves properly. Okay. This is where we learn that thinking is the only form of self-defense that we are allowed. And I refer to discipline, of course, and conducting ourselves in the Foucauldian sense. In the spring of 2025, Columbia University became a stage where the theater of rising totalitarianism unfurled in real time. I use the word theater here to speak of theatricality, not as a put-on falsity or as a sleight of hand that tricks or manipulates, but in the ways that it is used by performance studies, as everyday behaviors, rituals, cultural practices, making something come alive by virtue of calling up and generating in the audience embodied affects that have aesthetic and political implications. In other words, I'm thinking about the performative force of the theatrical. A year prior, meaning in 2024, police pit military-grade equipment in the streets and cops in tactical gear to battle Columbia students protesting the genocide in Gaza, all under a democratic administration. If militarism is the armed form of capitalism, the letter sent to Columbia by the Trump administration a year later got right to the money, linking $400 million worth of cuts in grants and contracts to a set of demands. The government, wrote Sheldon Pollock in The Guardian, quote, threatens to cut off two of the university's fingers, academic freedom and faculty governance, unquote. But this is not true. The government was not threatening to cut off the university's fingers. They didn't offer a contingency. The letter worked by kindling the university's impulse to cut off its fingers itself. And Columbia delivered, severing not just those two fingers, but more, removing students from serving on the university judicial board, which it now placed under the provost's office, effectively kneecapping due process, and putting under administrative control not only its Department of Middle Eastern Studies as was demanded, but also throwing in the South Asian and African Studies departments as a kind of bonus. An Ivy League overachiever, if there ever was one. What interests me in this capitulation, it's not its cowardice, however, but the following. Columbia effectively amputates its own body politic to get its funding restored, and it understands this amputation as a form of self-preservation. Similarly, Berkeley's throwing their faculty and students to the wolves is also not a move that defends the university's mission as a place of critical inquiry, but to the contrary, disarms it. Even though, of course, it is very much a move that is aligned with the neoliberalized university's conversion into a business and real estate enterprise. Right? Neoliberalism's hollowing out of the university is how these capitulations can be made to appear as making good business sense. But what I want to emphasize is that this self-preservative impulse is precisely what is targeted by fascism. Fascism stokes up fear, not only to cause compliance per se, but also to anticipate, intensify, sculpt, and prey upon the impulse to self-protect. A crucial distinction, of course, is necessary here. De la Girardier's self-defense and Columbia's and Berkeley's self-preservation are, of course, not equivalent. Self-defense is not just about the defense of one's own life. Even as it is about defending one's own life, it occurs in the context of defending values of justice and of liberation, about protecting the dignity of other people, about defending ideals of equality that go beyond the bound subject and extend to others, which is what de la Girardier was being punished for. Self-preservation, on the other hand, is more about protecting one's own narcissistic investments, protecting one's own personal resources and access, even to the detriment of others. It is, in J.D. Vance's words, to love locally, one's own circle of love. At a recent conference, a colleague comments that we're talking about Palestine, and in the Q&A, she comments that she cannot bear to watch videos of children being blown apart in Gaza because it makes her anxious about her own children's safety. My colleague, mind you, is white and lives in an upscale suburb in New York. Her children are not endangered, but this does not matter. What does matter is her libidinally bound, exaggerated sense of their, and thus her own self-precarity. Importantly then, self-preservation can even involve protecting others so long as those others are situated in concentric circles, in the center of which is one's own self. As a psychoanalyst, I appreciate that this woman feels precarious. Psychic reality and material reality are distinct, non-overlapping domains. But what I'm highlighting is that on the level of the political, self-preservation is organized around personal investments that pertain to one's bounded self and others proximal to or like oneself. It has no connection to justice, to dignity, or structural change. We begin to see that the differences between self-defense and self-preservation are considerable, and they carry important ethical ramifications, which means that we cannot afford to confuse them. Take, for example, Aaron Bushnell's self-immolation. Bushnell burned himself alive to protest, quote, what our ruling class has decided would be normal, unquote. But his action did more than that. It inspired many of us. What is inspiring, one might ask, about suicide? It is a powerful example, I would say, of how even amidst fascism, it is possible to self-defend one's sense of dignity, one's sense of value, one's orientation to community, without collapsing into the self-preservative. Why call this self-defense, you may ask, since it is not the self that is being defended? And this is one of my points today. That we have lost track of how impoverishing it is to the self to not be concerned with others and with justice. That there's something self-expansive about not being preoccupied with only one's own. And it is a defense, and that his action is a defense against the contraction of the self that amounts to looking out only for ourselves and our loved ones, when in fact power takes shape through the power that we can have, through solidarity and collective action. Resistance is the mainspring of community, offering thus an expansion of the self. Fascism, on the other hand, works by stimulating and in fact engorging the bound self-impulse for self-preservation. And I would say that when we justify somebody's unwillingness to act, citing their fear or their discomfort, when we empathize with their self-preservative orientation as part of their decision to look away or remain passive because they need to take care of themselves, we are in effect supercharging fascism's force. Again, I'm a clinician. I get why people are afraid. And it is also true that we're not all equally vulnerable. I'm well aware of how class, anti-Blackness, gender, immigration status, sexuality, minoritarian status can make some much more vulnerable than others. To want to pry the left away from its preoccupation with its own safety is not to carelessly ignore the vulnerabilities of people of color, of trans people and trans kids who have a clear target on their backs these days, of immigrants' disposability, or how anti-Blackness engineers genocidal projects. And if I could get my way, I would much rather see white and majoritarian subjects take more risks. But the truth is that those who have a lot don't risk it. Think of my colleague who won't even risk the discomfort of looking. And let's consider who's in the streets for Palestine, who's engaging in direct actions, not guarding themselves, but putting themselves on the line. It's mostly Arab comrades, trans and queer people, anti-Zionist Jews, immigrants, dock workers. Far too often, the liberal focus is on who can afford to take these risks, when risk is always unevenly distributed. Perhaps we can begin to see an uncritical and reflexive turn to self-preservation as a counterinsurgency tactic. Counterinsurgency tactics, Rodriguez writes, work, quote, to countervail and co-opt trajectories of revolutionary potential, unquote. There's no doubt and harshness in saying that self-preservation, our fears and our anxieties about what will happen to us if we act, should not have a say, the final say. And in this sense, my presentation today is itself an exercise of exigent sadism, a ruthlessness that is also a form of hope that we can risk resistance, that we may rethink the reflexive way in which we disavow violence. I'm inspired by resistance fighters who, amidst very unfavorable conditions and conditions that are stacked against them, like Leila Khalid and Soha Behara, who embrace the risk of resisting injustice, knowing that they will pay the price for it. All of them are able to counter the impulse to self-preservation, demonstrating what my colleague Lara Shiha calls psychic militancy. Though, as we've already seen, this is not purely something that we can produce by force of will, because it involves the psychic work of unbinding, which is nothing less than our ego's disruption. These are all forms of exercising a kind of ethical sadism towards the self's impulse to bind and to self-protect, and they draw on their exigency from the insurgence and fugitive possibilities of the sexual drive. The refusal to collaborate is costly. The refusal to disarm oneself endangers us, and it requires an ethic not of guarding ourselves, but of what Bataille called pure expenditure, a move that does not follow the logic of conservation, but the impulse of escalation in the service of what truly matters: justice, liberation, and equality. Overriding the desire to stabilize things requires formidable psychic strength, a critical momentum that is willing to follow the exigency of the drive without reserve to do what's necessary, which is to say that it also requires an exquisite vulnerability. Such sadism, we might say, works towards the surfacing of friction. It keeps at the wound rather than trying to close it, and that incubates possibilities for a different future, cultivating what Ernst Bloch calls militant hope. In the past year, we've been confronted daily with spectacles of violence. There's nothing new about the violence of the imperial carceral state, but there is something more spectacularized about the violence of the MAGA movement, the flaunting of militarized images of the National Guard in DC, the LA crackdown, the ICE LA crackdown, propaganda videos of masked agents terrorizing communities of color, kidnapping people from the streets, government officials like Kristi Noem posing before abductees in El Salvador. In Toscano's words, Trump's orientation to spectacle is undeniable. And this is where the aesthetic becomes important, because leftist politics also need theater, and they need performance. We're not in need of better arguments. We're in need of new and better mythologies, of new science fictions that can rouse our imaginations, that can engage our bodies in new, previously obstructed ways. The aesthetic is key to conducting ourselves differently. By speaking about theater and mythology, I'm picking up on my earlier point when I also referred to the theatricality of what unfolded at Columbia and the McCarthy's spectacle at Berkeley. Tracking Trump's rallies and performances, the academic and journalist Jeff Charlotte notes their powerful impact and emphasizes his skillful use of humor and his showmanship. Like it or not, and most of us on the left do not like it, he's a great performer. But not liking it often means that we cannot see or will not see and will not learn from how he's using performance. In his book, The Undertow: Scenes from a Slow Civil War, Charlotte shows how Trump's spectacularized performances have, in Pellegrini's words, quote, magnetized people into the fever dream of an America made great again through the appeal of authoritarian fascism, of the excitement of getting to hate in the name of love, quote. So while the left doubles down on reason and understanding, the right has become expertly deft at these forms of dangerous but exciting reenchantments. And since the left, as we saw, has also largely severed itself from the libidinal energy that comes from the capacity to embrace aggressivity, rage, and even sadism, we're mostly left disarmed, with great arguments, but disarmed. I will acknowledge my own envy, writes Pellegrini on an essay on hell houses. Hell houses are theatrical productions of evangelical Christian alternatives to conventional haunted houses that portray the frightening consequences of sin, such as abortion, homosexuality, drug use, with the aim of scaring people into repenting and accepting faith in Christ. I will acknowledge my own envy, they say. I feel no fear or repugnance for the effective surplus on display, for the camaraderie and sense of shared purpose and shared pleasure. In effect, for what the right is willing and able to do with affect and through performance. Some forms of queer liberation struggles may actually function as realms for secular enchantment, they argue, furnishing us with forms of affective experience that resist the flattening effects of secular rationality. Think, for example, of Jose Muñoz's writing about terrorist drag. The left, however, has yet to turn to them as modes of larger political rather than subcultural intervention. So I'm thinking also here with the philosophers Carmen Liadigue and Tae-Yu Kim, who argued for the importance of mythologizing as a key element to how societies respond to crisis. Where myth is predominantly conceived as illusory, false, and morally wrong, their work highlights how Western political philosophy has failed to take into account the role of myth-making and myth's relation with opacity as a far more critical apparatus than we want to acknowledge. To say this more sharply, and as I'm about to move into the performance piece I will be discussing, where the right has given us theater and mythological creations of extraordinary impact, the left has given us critique. Don't get me wrong, I like my theory, much as every other nerd in here. But, as Robin D.G. Kelley writes, fascism never disappears because people come to their senses. If we're going to move past the current impasse, we have to step into the more unsteady and perhaps more promising space of the theatrical to embrace the science fiction that art can curate for us. The role of the artist, Tony Bambara famously notes, representing an oppressed people is to make revolution irresistible. And it is this constitutive significance of irresistibility that I want to turn to next. Zones of Resplendence starts in a large, sparse room. The lighting is strong, even severe. You walk in to take a seat. Two motionless bodies are on stage. Both performers are on the floor wearing a garment from which hang a lush assemblage of uneven fabrics and thick threads in olive greens and light browns, an identifiably camouflage pattern. The performers' bodies are bent forward, their heads are touching the floor, covering the garment, their buttocks in the air, exposed, knees apart, their vulvas positioned towards you. The performance starts with a set of indeterminate sci-fi sounds that will run in the background through most of the piece, and to which the bodies begin to move rhythmically. The movements are slingy and awkward, curling their toes, placing them back on the floor. In long, drawn-out movements, they begin to lift the lower parts of their bodies, and now they're fully inverted. Torsos and heads are on the floor, knees in the air, bent. They curve languorously in angles that keep shifting with no apparent goal. There's nothing representational in this sequence that lasts for a while, a time during which we're given the space to experience this set of perplexing gestures with any claim to meaning. It's easy to feel confused, even abandoned, without direction as to how you are to relate to this strange encounter. After what feels like a really long time, the performers' feet touch the ground again. Their faces and torsos are still turned away from us. They raise their feet again, they arch them, they bend their knees in a choreography that is eerily, and depending on your psychology, either spacious or demanding, at times both. You're very aware that you haven't seen anybody's faces yet. You're dealing in body parts. You feel very raw. Slowly, the bodies spread out in full length, and they begin to roll. Faster, they're rolling across the stage, picking up the pace, start in a shift that feels in contrast with the earlier part. And as they're rolling furiously, as if they were carpets rolling on a hill, and before long they start to bump into each other and on the walls in ways that feel very violent. And this goes on for a bit, and you start becoming concerned for their safety, and you feel your own body rolling on the ground, the dizziness, confused as to what you're supposed to make of all this and why you're being made to watch it. You've so been held in abeyance that when 25 minutes in, the two performers stop rolling and then sit on their thighs, fold their hands before them, and as gravity pulls the hanging pieces of cloth down, you can finally see their faces. You feel a surge of relief and even gratitude. They touch each other's faces, tenderly drawing to the side hair messed up by the inversions, and then, in a synchronized move and as if in slow motion, they turn in one and the same direction, towards you. They look in your direction silently for a while. It is spooky. So far, it's all been about bodies. So when Carolina Mendonça begins to speak, you're jolted. Your full being turns to her words the way a sunflower is heliotropically tugged towards the sun. This is a long quote. My body started to feel differently some years ago. It felt like it was producing a new kind of fluid that was going through my veins. For lack of a better word, I started calling it rage. I didn't know what to do with it. I could feel there was something new taking form inside me, something sticky that had taken root. I would close my eyes and I would see it growing, a little bit more dense than my blood, greasy, a little bit warm. I had to go out to the city on long walks, not really knowing what I was doing and where I was going. Something boiling inside me, dragging me through the streets, taking me to places I was supposed to avoid. Since a very early age, I was more scared of what might be locked inside the house than what might be waiting for me in the deserted alley. It was more or less at that time that I started dreaming of guns. I would wake up thinking of how they shone, the well-polished weapon, the blinking, smoking glory of an automatic gun, the power that comes bursting from its barrel, the heavy metal feeling when you hold it in your hands. I became obsessed with the idea of guns. I would lay in bed thinking of how badly I needed a gun, any gun, a pistol gun, a rifle gun, a radical gun, a let me not catch you looking at me like that gun, a you have no idea what I'm capable of gun. I was thinking explosives, I was thinking dynamite, I was thinking strategy, I was thinking flames, I was thinking ethics. After some months of observing the liquid traveling through my body, I started playing with the idea of giving some focus to it. I started to feed the narrative that I could kill somebody. I heard that there were people gathering for armed struggle. I dream of joining them, unquote. She stops. They're back on the floor, spread out bodies again, rolling away and into each other. But you are still processing the words you heard. You've taken them in, and it's a lot to experience, and suddenly the slowness is no longer a problem. The texture of time in the room has changed. You realize you now need more time. They stop again and sit up. There is an army, Mendonça continues, quote, they call themselves the Gray Zone. They never meet in person. They connect to each other during 1 hour a day in a twilight zone. Some of them have already gone beyond the idea of a state. Sometimes they just talk, they just check on each other, they play games. But then there are those days when one of them is charged. They can all feel it, they all get upset, they get a little bit charged too. That is where they all turn to one and the same direction. Some of them imagine rays of light, others close their eyes and breathe deeply. But most of them just stay with their eyes wide open, their whole body there, pointing to one and the same direction, all of them, unquote. The sound changes. The room is filled with something strange, as if an entity has entered the room. You remember how the two performers just a few moments ago stopped rolling, sat up, and then synchronously turned their gaze towards you. And you realize that you too, alongside the other audience members, are also turned to one in the same direction. And you feel charged, though by what you can't tell. Are you part of these people, you wonder, this collective that is slowly gathering for armed struggle? Have you somehow been imperceptibly enlisted, and if so, to what? Can a work of art do some of the labor of political organizing? What is being charged in you, and what is it that you're being charged for? Mendonça stands up, shuffles to the edge of the room, her body bumping against the walls. Gently, then violently, she flings herself against the walls, scrap of her garment flailing in the air. It is as if watching a body being thrown around. The choreography shifts, and now she's moving as if dragged by some unseen force, though one can't quite tell if the force is internal or whether it comes from without, a confusion that seems to be entirely the point, until she falls on the floor and her body begins to roll again wildly. Her body is now slumped forward, seemingly unresponsive. Her co-performer, Ferrari, gets up, walks to her, bends her knees to lower her body, and hugs Mendonça's torso. And then in a smooth and sharp move, she lifts herself up, taking Mendonça over and onto her back. She begins to carry her. Paul Celan comes to mind. Quote, the world is gone, I must carry you, unquote. An enigmatic verse at the finitude of the world, the gone world as a mediating ground for the singularity of encounter. Ferrari lowers Mendonça's toneless body and deposits it against the wall. The curious thing, Mendonça says, is that we don't kill. Amazing how we will kill them. We should, given the statistics of how much we die, kill a lot more. But for some reason, perhaps glandular, perhaps physical, perhaps structural, perhaps ethical, we prefer not to kill. I would think that it would take some courage to be curious about that. This teasing of our curiosity about why we don't kill, about who the we is, and who those supposed to be killed surprises you, though perhaps it shouldn't. It is not a question that we, whoever the we is, think about a lot. It's not a question that I have heard formulated this way, in front of an audience, issued from within a slowed down, vulnerable place, a true question, a genuine question, not a demand, not an accusation, nevertheless an ask. It has as much the feeling of an announcement as it does of wonderment, perhaps even of a proposition. Unspoken, the matter of sexual violence floats untethered in the room. Quote, I used to remain alert and to spot things from afar. I bought whistles. I learned how to hold the key between two fingers and aim for the neck. I took jiu-jitsu lessons. I learned to barricade doors and windows, to walk down empty corridors with assurance. And more than once, I dreamt of acquiring tremendous physical force, make fear change sides. This is the second dream of the performance, and I am an analyst. But I don't think of symbols and meaning. It is Fanon that comes to mind. The first thing the colonial learns, he writes, is to remain in his place. Hence, the dreams of the colonized subject are muscular dreams, dreams of action, dreams of aggressive vitality. Mendonça, I realize, is rehearsing something. Her phrase, make fear change sides, startles me. Gisèle Pellicot comes to my mind, the 72-year-old woman who discovered that her husband had been drugging her and then inviting men, many men, 51 men, it turns out, to rape her while unconscious. It is only 2 days before watching this performance that Pellicot explained her determination to seek justice by saying that when it comes to sexual violence, it's time for shame to change sides. The similarity in their locution breaks me. Does Mendonça's light predate Pellicot's? It must. Have the two women arrived at it contemporaneously, both rehearsing something? Is this attunement part of how the army will form? In Blood in My Eye, written from prison, George Jackson discusses how fascism is enforced by police brutality when he announces, if terror is going to be the choice of weapons, there must be funeral on both sides. Mendonça, Pellicot, Jackson, I realized, are all looking in the same direction. They're all rehearsing something. This is the army that has been forming, an army of the oppressed that no longer buys into the propaganda that self-defense should be off the table, that our only mode of struggle should be our words, our reasoned analysis, and our votes. Mendonça's body is back on the floor, this repeated intensity that I can't get used to, and which conveys this piece's atmospheric violence, making it difficult, which is also the point. By the time she stops, she and Ferrari are back to torsos and faces on the floor, buttocks up in the air. Tina Turner's I Don't Want to Fight No More begins to play. They begin to move rhythmically to the music, their vulvas opening up and closing to Tina Turner. Mendonça's motions for the music to stop, and it does suddenly. There's no easy transition, she says, to where we're going next. She pulls a piece of paper from underneath what had previously seemed to be a seamless surface, and in an unhurried voice, she describes being sexually violated at age 5. Quote, I thought again about writing about it, and it occurred to me that I should not write at all, but clean my gun and check my kerosene supply. These are not poetic times at all. This is not about revenge, it's about something else. The first person I could not convince myself I had good reason not to kill was my grandfather. I'm 5 years old, but in a way, I'm no longer a child, unquote. She's told the violation is her fault. She keeps quiet. But when her aunt has a baby girl, she decides to speak. Quote, I'm sure he would continue, and I was the one having enough information to stop him. And I decided that my mother was the right person to talk to. She was his daughter, but she was also my mother. Later, I understood that it was not a very smart decision. But I was 10. I was doing the best I could. The conversation didn't last long. Something is leaving the shadow, maybe to something darker. Something is approaching. Something is approaching. And this is how the performance ends. Opaque and inconclusive, the first parts of Zones invites us to linger in the relay of body and duration, though invites is perhaps too gentle of a word for an experience that offers no respite. And in that sense, zones belongs to the kind of performance that Joshua Chambers Letson has described as, quote, bringing us into a relationship with the productive powers of opacity and unknowing, unquote. In zones, opacity and unknowing are distributed throughout the fabric of the aesthetic encounter. What Mendonça and Ferrari limn from the experience of violation is not oriented towards repair. It produces an odd form of traumatophilia, of working from within the wreckage. The army Mendonça fantasizes, her thoughts about guns, their weight, their shine, their meditations on why we don't kill, the liquid form of affect she calls rage, are all in an opaque relationship to each other. One can, of course, arrange them to tell a linear story, a story of revenge, and yet Mendonça says this is about something else. And indeed, there's nothing cathartic about zones. The offering of zones is about what can happen if one tries to imagine into the gaps of what is not represented, moving into the slippage between the piece's confusion and what we project onto it, into the negative space opening up when bodies roll against each other and into walls without recourse to remedy or repair, when muscles contract, and when memory and action conjoin under the banner of the question, why don't we kill them? Fanon writes, the muscles of the colonized are always tense. The symbols of society, the police force, military parades, the flag flying aloft, serve not only as inhibitors, but also as stimulants, unquote. It is not a given for Fanon that the presence of an oppressor deters us, as in the self-preservative mode. The stench of violence also stimulates and incites a muscular rumination that can prepare one for combat, though of what kind remains to be seen. But the recognition that violence does not just inhibit, that it can also stimulate a response, this can summon one to Mendonça's army, the army of those who will come together and will start looking in the same direction. Critical to the labor of this question is the way in which the piece employs confusion, how it wrings out of you a form of attentiveness that is not about the relief offered by meaning, but also about the ways in which confusion works on us. Confusion establishes an aesthetic relationship that has more to do with reach than grasp, a relation that involves one's own body responsiveness to nudity, vulnerability, and violence. And this is what makes zones not a manifesto, and it is also what makes it wildly traumatophilic. Is it possible to find a war through and by means of our wounds? And what do these wars look like? Zones has no time for what Berland has described as the reproduction of melodramatic conventions around trauma. Mendonça and Ferrari conduct trauma through their exquisite exposure. Incredibly, and I mean this in the sense of what we have been conditioned to think that is not credible, Zones achieves that effect not through its narrative act, but also and especially through the gaps between words, its pauses, abetted by this indeterminate sci-fi soundscape, through the thumping of bodies, through coaxing a certain kind of muscular tension towards the formless formation of this imaginary army. But if confusion is one of the piece's methods, so is a particular kind of aesthetic sadism, as the performance slowness forces us to endure something that relates to sexual violence, that drags us slowly through the anamnesis of violence that involve our bodies, including our eyes, taking in the unguarded, defenseless bodies of the performer. Muscular tension, Fanon says, can lubricate the explosion of revolutionary consciousness. The aesthetics of sadism enacted in zones are not seeking to enlarge possibilities of survival or reach some healing. To the contrary, zones rouses the audience's musculature through the mythologizing of this army that calls itself the gray zone. Guns, the kerosene supply, armies are only some of the possibilities arising from the wound. An army coagulating through muscular tension, gathering for armed struggle, an army really that expands our imagination around violence. What if it became routine for perpetrators to have to worry about what the violated can become capable of? For Dorlin, this is less about learning to fight and more about unlearning not to fight. What if we took the rousing of our sadism, its possibilities, and its pleasures seriously? Wound aesthetics do not lend themselves to plans and projects. What they stand to do is offer different forms of mythologizing, to plant an idea, to awaken us to our musculature, not through education, not even through communal support. For many of us, this arrives not as a recognition, but as a crisis coursing through our bodies against our reason's consent, against the consent of our egos. which are bound through notions of a social life where violence is the exclusive purview of those in power. How did we ever get to consent to that? Why, echoes Mendonca's voice, do we not kill them? What will it take for us to consider this seriously, which is not the same as taking it only at its word? Is this an incitement for violence? I don't know, and I can't tell. But I do know that my body feels different. Somebody I just met leans over after the performance is completed and says to me, I never thought about getting a gun before, but look at me, he says, pointing to his femme body, implying, I gather, his vulnerability. How, why would this never cross my mind? The work of the colonist, Fanon says, is to make our dreams of liberty impossible. The work of the colonized is to imagine every possible method of annihilating the colonist. What opens up if we stop synchronizing ourselves to the beat of, I don't want to fight no more? Is there another soundtrack for this dreamscape? I'm thinking of Palestine, of our insurgent actions. I'm thinking of the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, calling for the formation of a World Salvation Army to liberate Palestine. I'm thinking of Marsha P. Johnson describing her mace as a bomb that she's willing to throw if assaulted, of Said defending himself against the Freud Museum's accusations, saying that it was not a stone but a pebble. What if it was a stone? I'm thinking of Luigi Mangione, whose alleged killing of the United Healthcare CEO so excited the imagination of so many people who held their breath to see if he would be caught, hoping he had escaped. Make fear change sides, funerals on both sides. Many in the LGBT community, says Gwen Patton, the rep for gay guns rights organization Pink Pistols National, have never seriously considered whether they want to be a victim or whether they want to survive an attack. I'm thinking of Rodney Hinton, the black man from Ohio charged with killing a cop after his own son was shot dead by the police, of his contracted facial muscles dripping with disdain. In her first session after Charlie Kirk's murder, Farla talks about Tylen Robinson. Did you hear, she asks, flushed, that he was dating a trans woman? What an ally. And then guiltily, I want trans folks to be afraid too. Farla is not threatening to hurt anyone. She's saying something many have said in the past year. Is this how one gets in line to join Mendonca's army to train for combat? By admitting to ourselves that we're not innocent, which is not the same thing as to say we're guilty? Mendonca's words ring in my ears. These are not poetic times. I think of Adorno and his misquoted lines about it being barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz. I'm thinking of Fakhreddin writing about the necessity of poetry after Gaza. What if poetics are not about metaphors, but about the aesthetics of resistance? I'm not sure if in speaking to you today, I'm speaking to the choir. Most of us here know that we must resist no matter what, and that the stakes are high and that it will cost us. Or if my thoughts about sadism and violence, about stepping off the self-preservative, frightened you. But if you find that there are things in my talk today that have been said before, which of course they have, I want to close with the artist Ethan Philbrick, who describes Anna Devere Smith's response to being challenged about art that addresses an audience about something they agree with. Yes, she says, perhaps leftist political art does preach to the choir, but don't we need choir practice? Unquote. For her, he explains, that was a way of saying that the critique of leftist political art as speaking to the choir imagines political art as a form of political conversion therapy. The political art is only doing what we want it to do when our political enemies are in the audience and the art is so good and so moving that the audience has a radical belief reversal. But maybe what Smith is telling us is that it's okay to do it because it is we who need practice. Unquote. I was writing about sadisms before zones, but it is because of zones that I think of exigent sadism as muscular theory. And this is why, when I started my talk, I said that this is not an argument, that it has to be a preparation for something else. Thank you.
Thank you, Avgi. So inspired. I'm thinking about Vaya Rustin's words when you said the only weapon that we have is our bodies, and we have to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn. And I'm thinking about Diana de Prima, Revolutionary Letters, where she says, "This flesh is all I have to offer." And just thinking about the potential of performance to, as a shock to people's own vulnerability and action, and the work that you're presenting, does it stay only in the aesthetic, like this shock that we're feeling in our bodies that is enfleshed, that is hopefully taking us into action? I'm interested in the book that you're writing and other performances, and also as a performance artist, how trying to find purpose in the crisis that we're living, and just seeing you write this as a kind of hopeful love letter or something. So what are other artists and this ways of thinking about performance as this shock into our own vulnerabilities, and not just the privilege that we exercise, or the example of your friend being worried about her children?
She's not my friend.
Yeah, well, or sorry, the professor.
I don't want friends like this.
Yes.
I think it's interesting to hear you say flesh, because it's impossible to hear flesh without thinking with Spillers, and the way in which, like, what Spillers does with thinking about, like, the turning of the black body into flesh, and the possibilities that can come from that kind of dispossession. It reminds me actually of some of the things that Stephen was saying in the introduction, like how accustomed we have become to thinking in certain ways about kind of like certain cliches, certain ways that make us feel good about ourselves, that we're attentive to difference, we're attentive to anti-blackness, and really end up producing and reproducing and stabilizing very constricted ways about thinking about our power, about revolutionary power, the power of dispossession. I mean, there's obviously a lot written in the Black tradition about dispossession, not just, and you know, it's a complicated thing to be saying in the midst of a genocide where dispossession also has many, many different meanings, but there's also something about letting go of the attachment to oneself, the libidinal conviction that it's mostly about your own circle of love. Like, there's a reason why I put J.D. Vance there as a representation not of a fascist, but of a liberal ethic around what it means to be in the genocide and to be caring about whether you're going to be traumatized seeing images when the world is burning. That there's something really urgent about that. So the word flesh, the question of our bodies can do different things than our minds can do. Our minds are very trained to become docile. And I have a lot of hope in performance. Performance cannot accomplish that for us. Not by itself. You're still left with something that you have to decide what you're going to do with. And you see, people see performance and they consume it like an interesting thing they get to talk about, and other people feel changed by it. And that's not something that I think can be planned or orchestrated. Thank you, Emilio.
Drawing on some takeaways from a recent talk by Suad Johnson. I'm trying to do her justice by remembering her name. Suad Joseph, through the Palestinian Department of Palestinian Studies that's here, or Palestinian Studies Center, on trauma and the address and need to reclaim the language of trauma in order to speak about Palestine. She levied a critique, which I think is rightful, about the formation of psychology and also its presence in psychoanalysis of the individual subject, and the subject individuation as being, a primary form by which trauma is individually subjectivized, in much in a similar way to your colleague. This individual subjectification is then materialized through things as immaterial as witness, or third, fourth hand kind of account. And so I'm interested, especially with the duality of the performance that you're looking at, how a process of moving away from individuation, or maybe even weaponizing that individuation back maybe plays into this.
I mean, that I think is a really important, it's a really important turn. And I'll speak as a clinician for a moment, as a clinician who talks every day with clinicians who struggle with how to negotiate that difference between the person who's sitting across from you, who's genuinely scared, and the fact that being genuinely scared is part of how fascism does its work. And clinicians are having conversations that try, but I think fall short all the time these days about kind of like, what's the place of the political? Does it belong even in the midst of a genocide? People are having, even in the midst of a genocide, psychoanalytic institutions are inviting, the new Center for Psychoanalysis has an event next week with somebody who's going to talk about the trauma of the Israeli soldier who has to go out and kill. Yes. Yes. And our community is not up in arms about this. And I say the word up in arms very purposefully. This is what I mean by muscular theory. It's not just about having guns, even though there's a reason why they're trying, where the idea has been floated that maybe trans people shouldn't have guns, right? So, you know, like, so this is not only about having guns, but this is also about getting riled up and not just trying to have everything be contained, because we have to somehow become interested and concerned and upset about things that do not affect us right now, for those that do not affect us right now, even though arguably that threshold has been crossed. How do you do that? I don't know how to do that. Like, I'm thinking of Nadia Abu El-Haj, who talks about moral injury, talks about the weaponization of the category of trauma and the individualizing of the category and trauma in a way that makes it kind of like, it's hard as a clinician to not feel deeply ashamed and deeply angry at my field. We are doing so much damage, especially right now. But we want to talk about the damage we did like 20 years ago, or the damage that we'll invite a person of color to give a talk, and maybe that does something. It's really shameful. But it's not just my field, of course. Like, people are, I mean, your university just gave 160 names, right? What does it mean to feel the rage of what is happening, of what we're being made to be complicit in? These are very serious questions, and part of what excites me about Mendonca's work is that she doesn't do it through works. She doesn't do it through arguments. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This is going to sound like a hysterical question. And I wish I weren't the one asking it. And I just want to say that I'm asking it from a position of a great deal of solidarity with your talk. But I hear certain echoes of, well, the simplest way of asking the question is I think about 5% of the room is wearing a mask, and the rest of you aren't.
Yeah.
Which ones are more invested in a certain fiction of self-protection? And is it the fiction, because I think what you're talking about is actually the fiction of protecting a certain psychic sense of invulnerability or independence, agency, et cetera, an investment in a psychic self that is not subject and not vulnerable to something that believes in the fiction that there are those of us who are immunocompromised are doing what we can to protect ourselves, but the rest of us can accept the lie of the Biden administration that the pandemic is over and it's only affecting a certain. So I just, again, I know this is not the topic of your talk, but it's very hard not to hear certain echoes of an ableist community online that is poo-pooing people who are actually participating, as Aaron Bushnell was, in forms of self-care. And when, in fact, I see most of my colleagues perpetuating harms, because they are not willing to take the risk of actually acknowledging one another, their vulnerability, and the ways in which they are interacting with other vulnerable people. So thank you.
Yeah, I don't think that this is not the topic of my talk, and I don't hear what you're saying is hysterical at all, even though it's difficult to hear because here I am not wearing a mask myself. But I think these are the questions that need to be asked, because this is not just about Palestine or just about trans people or people. This is about coalitional politics. And as I say this to you, I am I'm aware of how I am doing the very thing that you're describing. And this is what I mean about, like, I'm going to have to sit with this now. And not just sit with this in the sense of, oh, I'll think about it and I'll come up with a smart answer. Like, I have to let it hit me. So I'm grateful for what you're bringing up. And I hope that we'll think about it and let it hit us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lecture. So, like, we just got a version of something a question or two ago that kind of referenced, like, what is the place of politics in psychoanalysis or politics in the clinic? And listening to this lecture, my question is maybe starting to think through the inverse of that, which is, what is the place of the clinic in the more broadly political? Or to put it a different way, is there a way we can think about instrumentalizing a locally non-instrumental space of exigent sadism?
Do you mean this in the sense of how do you use the clinic to do political work? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I think that's with this in mind, that, like, we are trying to, like, move in this instrumentalizing direction.
I think this is a really interesting and important question. And I'm thinking of two kinds of incommensurabilities between the urgency of the now and the temporality of clinical work, which is that things in clinical work happen very, very slow. And sometimes we as clinicians hide behind that slowness, which is its own separate problem. But it is also the case that psychic change, real psychic change, not somebody learning to say, the psychic change that I'm being challenged by our colleague who was speaking about masking, the kind of psychic change that is, for that to become truly psychic, as opposed to just learning to do it differently or do it differently so that people won't say anything, or that is very, very slow. So there's a temporal discontinuity, which is not to say that clinicians should not be thinking of the political, that we should not be preoccupied, even when our patients are not, especially when our patients are not, with what's happening in the social world. This is a huge issue, contested issue in the field right now. I think it has tremendous potential, but it's a hugely contested issue. I can't tell you how many organizations are having issues resign or are breaking up, kind of coming undone over these kinds of conversations. I can't speak for the field. I can only speak about how I think about this clinically, and I think a lot about politics, and I bring politics a lot in the room. And I see them as being connected to patients' dynamics. I don't see them as imposing an agenda. Like they're there just because we're in this world. No.
I think I saw two more hands in the middle of the room.
Hi, thanks for your talk. My question, I think, is more about you as a clinician and theorist, non-American. So I was wondering, it's my understanding that when you speak about clinical work, you're referring to, like, psychoanalysts or people that engage in, like, psychotherapy. And it's my understanding, or the sense that I get, that here there are so many other, like, schools that are really taking, like, over, I would say. I was very shocked when I got here. And that, in a certain way, for us to reclaim trauma, it's also, like, to make clear, like, the scope that that trauma has, as opposed to other ways of just thinking, individualizing that as, like, a wiring of the brain. I remember, like, taking a test because I had to take, and the question was, like, any traumatic experiences? To which I said, well, I think that, like, for some, entering language can be framed as a traumatic experience. So, like, that, in a certain way, ridiculous. I put that, I was surprised, but also really shocked by, okay, so what do we, like, think trauma to be in this context of different like approaches.
This is a very large conversation that you're opening and a very interesting one. But if I may take your question in a slightly kind of like oblique direction, tangentially related to what you're saying, is like we're also so accustomed to learning how to protect ourselves from being traumatized. And the reason why I said that this is a prospective way of thinking traumatophilically is to not take it as a given that if you're going to be upset by something, or if it's going to give you nightmares about whether your kid is safe, when your kid is actually in their, in your, expensive home in their bedroom, that you actually take the step into that. And I think that that's a question of ethics. And it's not about moralizing. Like, I can say this, I can say, I don't want friends like this. Who cares, right? The question is, what are the kinds of experiences that can shake people out of these positions? And that's why I'm offering the aesthetic as one domain where that can happen, not through persuasion, because I don't think persuasion takes us very far. What does it mean to allow oneself to become traumatized? Rather than hoarding is the way that comes to mind, the fantasy that that's not for me, that's for others.
Thanks for the talk. You referenced the Black Panther Party and decolonial movements, but it also brought to mind other strands of political Marxism, particularly how Rosa Luxemburg talks about the mass strike almost in this way of releasing libidinal energy. Gramsci talks about the modern prince, the Revolutionary Party, having this sort of mythic character. And Chantal Mouffe, of course, advocates for the redirecting of political passions, antagonisms, rather than suppressing them. So kind of to restate that, I wonder, is the mass strike the choreography of exigent sadism? Is the Revolutionary Party the vehicle of exigent sadism? And is agonism the language of exigent sadism? So how are you thinking of exigent sadism in relation to existing historical organizational forms?
It's a very interesting and good listing of like the various dimensions along which this can happen. What I'm trying to draw our attention to is how exigent sadism requires not just a willingness to mobilize aggression towards others, but also the willingness to mobilize a certain kind of ruthlessness towards oneself. There's the question of like who can afford to strike, for example, right? This is both materially on the ground a meaningful question. It's also a way to like stop strikes, because of course, like a strike, if you're a worker, is going to cost. And people who are like the dock workers right now in Italy, in Genoa, who are stopping the kind of like the transfer of weapons and of fuel to Israel, they are kind of like they're losing money. They're not losing money that they would put in the bank. They're probably losing money that they need to survive. So there's also something about being able to mobilize something that is against yourself in the interest of something else. This is the point that I'm trying to make, and this is work in progress. And I'm trying to also flesh some of these things, the difference between self-preservation and self-defense. That you may lose your income or your wage, but there's something bigger. Is the bigger going to feed you? It's not. But then other possibilities may open up. And I think that the short-term assessment of how do you put this on the balance without being able to imagine what else might open up. Like in the last 2 years, a bunch of us have left psychoanalytic institutions that have been acting the way they have. And for every opportunity, every door I've closed, like I've been organizing with new people and have been imagining things that I wouldn't have been able to imagine within the institutions. So there's also something about the letting go of one vine, and you're suspended in midair before another one appears, but the next one does not appear until you're suspended. And that's a risk. It may not. And there's something about like you have to be exigent to yourself. Exigency is not just something directed towards others, and that's why it needs the energy of the sexual drive, because I have a piece about this in Social Text that's coming out in the spring. It's about expenditure and not what I'm calling austerity thinking. Thank you.